The morning Sarah Bennett walked into the Henderson County Historical Society in western North Carolina, she had no idea she was about to uncover one of Appalachia's most puzzling mysteries. It was a crisp October day in 2019, the kind where the Blue Ridge Mountains wore their finest autumn colors like a patchwork quilt of amber, crimson, and gold. Sarah, a 34-year-old documentary researcher from Asheville, had spent the last 6 years investigating forgotten stories from the Appalachian region. Her work focused on the everyday people who built these mountain communities, the ones who never made it into history books but whose labor and lives formed the backbone of American expansion at the turn of the 20th century. The Historical Society occupied a converted brick building that once served as a general store. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, wood polish, and the faint mustiness that accompanies carefully preserved documents. Margaret Walsh, the Society's 72-year-old curator, greeted Sarah with the warm smile of someone who lived for these moments when someone actually cared about the past. "I pulled everything we have on the New Salem Baptist Church," Margaret said, leading Sarah to a research table near the window. Afternoon light streamed through the glass, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. The church stood from 1879 until a fire destroyed it in 1943. "We've got ledgers, meeting minutes, and about 200 photographs from various church events." Sarah settled into her chair and began the methodical work she loved. Each photograph was a window into another time, frozen moments of lives lived fully and then forgotten. There were baptisms in the nearby creek, summer revivals under canvas tents, Sunday school classes with children in their finest clothes despite the obvious poverty most families endured. Then she found it. The photograph was larger than the others, a formal portrait taken inside the church. The date, written in careful script on the back, read September 15, 1901. 23 people stood in rows, the men in dark suits despite the late summer heat, the women in high-collared dresses with their hair pinned severely. The church's interior was simple but dignified, with plain wooden pews and a pulpit draped with white linen. But it was the figure standing at the edge of the back row that captured Sarah's attention. A young woman, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, wearing a plain gray dress markedly different from the other women's clothing. Her posture was slightly apart from the group, yet she gazed directly at the camera with an expression that Sarah could only describe as quietly defiant. Sarah turned the photograph over again. The handwritten caption listed every person in the image by name, position in rows from left to right. Back row, far right, household servant, name unknown. "Margaret," Sarah called out, trying to keep her voice steady despite the excitement rising in her chest. "Can you come look at this?" The older woman approached, adjusting her reading glasses. Sarah pointed to the servant in the photograph. "Everyone else is named. Why isn't she?" Margaret studied the image, her brow furrowing. "That is odd. Let me check our church registry from that year." She disappeared into the archive room and returned 15 minutes later with a leather-bound book, its spine cracked with age. She opened it carefully, turning pages until she found September 1901. "Here's the list of everyone who attended that Sunday," Margaret said, running her finger down the handwritten entries. 37 people signed the attendance book. But look, the photograph only shows 23 people. This was clearly a special portrait, probably of the church leadership and their families. "So who was she serving?" Sarah asked. Margaret pointed to a distinguished-looking couple in the front row, center position. "That's Reverend Thomas Cartwright and his wife, Abigail. They led the church from 1897 until 1911. Very prominent family. Thomas's father was a judge, and Abigail came from money, unusual for these parts. She inherited a large farm from her parents." Sarah made notes rapidly. "And their servant? Any record of who worked for them?" "Let me check the household census records," Margaret said, a hint of intrigue creeping into her voice. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't just another research query. They spent the next 2 hours combing through census records, tax documents, and property deeds. The Cartwright household appeared in the 1900 census, conducted just a year before the photograph was taken. Reverend Thomas Cartwright, age 42. Abigail Cartwright, age 38. 3 children, Emma, age 15, James, age 12, and Ruth, age 8, that NO servant was listed. Maybe she was hired after the census, Margaret suggested, though her tone betrayed her doubt. Sarah nodded slowly, but something felt wrong. In early 20th century Appalachia, especially among the more prosperous families, live-in servants were always documented. They appeared in census records, church registries, sometimes even in personal letters and diaries. To have someone living in your home and not appear anywhere in official records was nearly impossible. Do you have any personal papers from the Cartwright family? Sarah asked. Margaret's eyes lit up. Actually, yes. Abigail Cartwright kept extensive diaries. Her great-great-granddaughter donated them to us about 10 years ago. They're in our climate-controlled vault. Give me a few minutes. While Margaret retrieved the diaries, Sarah returned to the photograph. She pulled out her portable magnifying glass and examined every detail. The young woman's face was clear, sharply in focus. She had delicate features, dark hair pulled back in a simple style, and those remarkable eyes that seemed to look right through the camera and across more than a century directly at Sarah. There was something else. A small detail Sarah almost missed. Around the servant's neck hung a simple locket on a thin chain. Sarah could just make out an engraving on its surface, though she couldn't quite decipher what it was. Margaret returned with 3 leather-bound volumes, handling them with the reverence they deserved. These cover 1896 through 1912, she said. Abigail wrote nearly every day. She documented everything: weather, crops, church activities, family life. She was meticulous. Sarah opened the volume covering 1901. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded but still legible. She turned to September 15th, the date of the photograph. Today we had our portrait taken at the church after morning services. Thomas insists it will be important for posterity to have a record of the church's leadership during these transformative times. The children behaved admirably, though James did complain about the heat in his Sunday suit. The photographer, Mr. Holloway from Asheville, was quite professional. Sarah read the entry 3 times. Not a single mention of the servant. She flipped back through the previous weeks, looking for any reference to hiring household help or anyone new joining the household. Nothing. This doesn't make sense, Sarah murmured. Look at the photograph. This woman is standing with the family in an official church portrait. She's literally positioned among the Cartwrights. Even if she was a servant, her presence was significant enough to include her in this important photograph. But Abigail doesn't mention her at all in her diary. Not on the day of the photograph, not before, not after. Margaret pulled up a chair beside Sarah, and together they began reading through months of diary entries. They learned intimate details of the Cartwright family life. Abigail wrote about her children's educations, her husband's sermons, visiting church members who were ill, the difficulty of managing the farm during drought seasons. She mentioned several people by name who helped with various tasks: Matthew Turner, who assisted with the harvest; Eliza Porter, who came weekly to help with laundry; young Billy Henderson, who tended the horses, but no mention of a live-in servant. No reference to the young woman who stood with them in that September photograph. As the afternoon wore into evening, Margaret finally said what they were both thinking. Sarah, I've been doing this work for 30 years. I've never seen anything quite like this. People in photographs are always in the record somewhere. Boys. If they lived in town, if they worked for a prominent family, if they attended church, there's a paper trail. Tax records, census data, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records. Something. Sarah gathered the photograph in her notes. Margaret, would it be possible for me to get copies of everything related to the Cartwrights? The photograph, relevant diary entries, census records, church documents. Of course, Margaret said, already heading to the copy machine. Sarah, what do you think happened? Why would this woman be in the photograph but nowhere in the records? Sarah looked at the photograph one more time before slipping it into her bag. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out who she was. The drive back to Asheville took 40 minutes through mountain roads that curved like ribbons through the darkening landscape. Sarah's mind raced with questions. Who was the woman in the photograph? Why was she with the Cartwright family? And most troubling of all, why did someone want to erase her from history, When Sarah reached her small apartment in downtown Asheville, she immediately set up her research materials on her dining table. The photograph took center position, and she arranged copies of the documents around it like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. She made a cup of tea and pulled out her laptop, beginning the work she did best, digging into the past to uncover truths that time tried to bury. She started by researching the photographer, James Holloway, who had taken the portrait. If she could find his studio records, maybe there would be information about who commissioned the photograph or who paid for it. By midnight, Sarah had compiled a basic timeline. Holloway operated a photography studio in Asheville from 1895 to 1917. He specialized in family portraits and church events. His business records were donated to the University of North Carolina Archives in 1972 by his grandson. Sarah sent an email to the university's special collections librarian requesting access to Holloway's records from 1901. Then she searched for any descendants of the Cartwright family who might still live in the area. The genealogical search revealed that Reverend Thomas Cartwright's line had continued through his son James. James had 2 daughters, one of whom, Catherine Cartwright Wilson, still lived in Henderson County. She was 89 years old and resided in an assisted living facility in Hendersonville. Sarah made a note to contact her in the morning. If anyone had family stories or knowledge about the household during that time, it would be Catherine. As she finally prepared for bed at 2 in the morning, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled onto something significant. The woman in the photograph haunted her thoughts. There was something in that direct gaze, something that seemed to reach across time with a silent plea. Remember me, find out who I was, don't let me disappear completely. Sarah fell asleep with the photograph on her nightstand, the servant's face the last thing she saw before closing her eyes. The Mountain View Senior Living Facility sat on a hill overlooking Hendersonville, its sprawling grounds planted with oak trees that had witnessed decades of the town's transformation. Sarah arrived on a Thursday morning, having called ahead to arrange a visit with Catherine Cartwright Wilson. A nurse led Sarah through hallways decorated with autumn wreaths and photographs of residents at various activities. Catherine's room was at the end of the hall, facing east where morning sunlight streamed through large windows. Catherine sat in an armchair beside the window, a knitted shawl around her shoulders despite the warm October weather. She was thin but alert, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. When Sarah entered, Catherine smiled warmly. "You must be the researcher who called about my great-grandfather," Catherine said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Please, sit down. It's not often someone wants to talk about family history anymore." Sarah settled into the chair across from Catherine and pulled out the photograph. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm researching the New Salem Baptist Church and came across this portrait from 1901. I was hoping you might recognize some of the people in it." Catherine took the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, holding it close to study the faces. A smile of recognition crossed her features. "Oh my, that's great-grandfather Thomas in the front, and great-grandmother Abigail beside him. Such a stern-looking couple, but by all accounts, they were quite devoted to each other and to the church." "Did you know them?" Sarah asked. "Great-grandfather died before I was born, but I knew great-grandmother Abigail. She lived until I was 12. I remember visiting her farm in the summers. She was ancient by then, nearly 90, but still sharp as a tack. She'd tell me stories about the old days, about building the church, about the community." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Did she ever mention having household help? Servants?" Catherine thought for a moment. "Oh, various people helped on the farm over the years. It was a large property. But I don't recall her mentioning anyone who lived in the house with them. Why do you ask?" Sarah pointed to the figure at the edge of the photograph. "This woman is identified only as household servant, name unknown. But I can't find any record of her in census data, church registries, or anywhere else. She appears in this photograph but nowhere in the historical record." Catherine studied the photograph more closely, bringing it nearly to her nose. When she looked up, there was something different in her expression. Recognition? Uncertainty? Sarah couldn't quite read it. "May I ask you something strange?" Catherine said slowly. "Of course. When I was a girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, I found a locket in great-grandmother Abigail's jewelry box. It was old, tarnished silver, with initials engraved on it. I asked her about it, and her reaction was odd. She took it from me very quickly and told me never to touch it again. She became quite upset, which was unusual for her. She was typically very patient with me. Sarah's heart began to race. Do you remember what the initials were? Catherine closed her eyes, reaching back through 79 years of memories. I think C and M. Or maybe M and C. It was so long ago. But I remember being startled by how emotional she became. What happened to the locket? I assume it stayed with her belongings. When she died, most of her personal items went to my grandmother, her daughter Emma. Then eventually to my mother. But I never saw that particular locket again. Sarah made careful notes. The locket detail might be crucial. If the woman in the photograph was wearing a locket with those initials, it could help identify her. Mrs. Wilson, do you have any of your great-grandmother's belongings? Letters, photographs, anything from that period? Catherine nodded toward a closet. There's a box on the top shelf. When Mother died 5 years ago, I couldn't bear to throw away the few family things she'd kept. Maybe there's something useful in there. With Catherine's permission, Sarah retrieved the box. It was surprisingly light, containing mostly photographs from later decades. But at the bottom, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. I'd forgotten about those, Catherine said as Sarah carefully untied the ribbon. They're letters to great-grandmother Abigail from her sister, Margaret, who lived in Charleston. They wrote frequently. Sarah unfolded the first letter. The date was July 1901, just 2 months before the photograph was taken. The handwriting was different from Abigail's, more flowing and informal. My dearest Abigail, I was delighted to receive your letter and to hear that your household concerns have been resolved. Thomas is right to insist on discretion. In these times, we must guard our reputations carefully. I trust the arrangement you've made will serve everyone's best interests. Do write soon and let me know how things progress. Your devoted sister, Margaret. Sarah read the letter twice. Mrs. Wilson, do you know what household concerns this might refer to? Catherine shook her head. I have no idea. But it sounds like something significant happened, doesn't it? Sarah continued through the letters. Most were mundane, discussing family matters, social events, and community news. But in a letter dated October 1901, just weeks after the photograph, Margaret wrote, I am relieved to hear the situation has stabilized. You were right to keep the matter private. Some things are better left unspoken, even among family. There's definitely something here, Sarah said, her excitement building. These letters suggest some kind of secret or sensitive situation in the Cartwright household around the time this photograph was taken. Catherine watched Sarah with interest. You really think this is important? Mrs. Wilson, someone was living in or connected closely with your great-grandparents' household. Someone significant enough to be included in an official church portrait. But every official record fails to acknowledge this person's existence. That's not an accident. Someone deliberately kept this woman out of the records. But why? That's what I need to find out. Before leaving, Sarah photographed all the letters with Catherine's permission and left her contact information. If you remember anything else, no matter how small, please call me. Catherine smiled. You know, I've been sitting in this room for 3 years, thinking my memories were just that, memories. But you've made me realize that the past isn't really past. It's still here, waiting for someone to care enough to understand it. Sarah's next stop was the University of North Carolina's Wilson Special Collections Library in Chapel Hill, a 3-hour drive from Hendersonville. She'd received an email the previous evening confirming that James Holloway's photography studio records were available for research. The library was a modern building on campus, but inside, it housed treasures from centuries past. Sarah filled out the request forms and waited at a research table while a librarian retrieved the Holloway collection. 20 minutes later, the librarian returned with 3 archival boxes. These contained business ledgers, correspondence, and negative storage logs from 1900 to 1910, she explained. You'll need to handle everything with gloves, and no photographs are allowed, but you can make notes. Sarah put on the provided cotton gloves and opened the first box. The ledgers were organized chronologically, with entries noting each client, the type of photograph taken, the date, and the payment received. She found the entry for September 15, 1901. New Salem Baptist Church, Henderson County. Group portrait, 23 subjects. Commissioned by Reverend Thomas Cartwright. Payment, $12. 3 prints ordered, delivered October 2, 1901. $12 was a significant sum in 1901, equivalent to perhaps $300 today. Clearly, this was an important portrait to the Cartwrights, but there was something else. A small notation at the bottom of the entry, almost too faint to read. Special instruction per client request. No identification of final subject on back row. Sarah's hands trembled as she copied the note exactly. This was the proof she needed. It wasn't an oversight or missing information. The Cartwrights had specifically requested that the servant not be identified in the photograph. She spent another hour searching through Holloway's correspondence files. In a folder marked September-October 1901, she found a letter from Reverend Cartwright to Holloway, dated September 12. Mr. Holloway, as we discussed during our meeting, I require your absolute discretion regarding one member of the group who will appear in our church portrait on the 15th. This individual should be included in the photograph but must not be identified by name in any written record or caption. I trust this arrangement is acceptable and will be honored. The additional compensation we discussed should cover any inconvenience. Sincerely, Reverend Thomas Cartwright. There was confirmation that the omission was deliberate and that Cartwright had paid extra to ensure the woman's anonymity. But why include her in the photograph at all? If the goal was to hide her identity, why not simply exclude her from the portrait entirely? Sarah photographed her notes and thanked the librarian. On the drive back to Asheville, her mind worked through the puzzle pieces. The servant appeared in an official church portrait but with no name. She lived with or was connected to the Cartwrights but appeared in no records. The Cartwrights paid extra to ensure her anonymity. Abigail had kept a locket with initials that made her emotional decades later. The sisters' letters referenced a sensitive household matter that required discretion. Back in her apartment, Sarah spread everything out on her dining table. She needed to approach this systematically, like the investigative researcher she trained to be. She created a timeline. 1900 census. No servant listed in Cartwright household July 1901. Letters mention household concerns being resolved September 15, 1901. Church portrait taken. Servant included but not identified October 1901. Letters mention situation stabilized. Matters better kept private. What could cause a respectable minister and his wife to hide someone's identity while still acknowledging their presence in such a public way? Sarah considered several theories. Perhaps the woman was a relative fallen on hard times, and the family felt shame about her reduced circumstances. Maybe she had a scandalous past they were trying to protect. Could she have been running from something or someone? Then another thought struck her. Sarah returned to the photograph and examined it closely with her magnifying glass, focusing on the servant's clothing, her posture, her expression. The dress the woman wore wasn't quite right for a servant's attire. It was plain, yes, but the cut and quality of the fabric suggested something different. And her posture, while somewhat apart from the group, wasn't subservient. She stood with quiet dignity, her chin level, her gaze direct. Sarah called Margaret Walsh at the Historical Society. Margaret, it's Sarah Bennett. I need to ask you something about clothing from the 1900s. Of course, dear. What can I help with? If a woman was wearing a gray dress, simple but well-made, high-collared and long-sleeved, what would that typically indicate about her social status in 1901? Margaret thought for a moment. Well, servants typically wore much coarser fabrics, often cast-offs from their employers. A well-made dress in good fabric would suggest someone of at least modest means. Gray was also a common color for what? For women in mourning, Margaret said slowly. After the first year of deepest mourning in black, women often transition to gray or lavender for another year or two. Sarah, do you think this woman was in mourning? I think it's possible, Sarah said. Which raises the question, who was she mourning? After hanging up, Sarah returned to the census records, this time expanding her search beyond the Cartwright household. She looked for any deaths in Henderson County in 1900 or early 1901 that might connect to this mystery. It took hours of searching through digitized death certificates and church burial records, but finally, she found something. In March 1901, a man named Charles Manning had died in Henderson County. Age 24. Cause of death, pneumonia. Burial, New Salem Baptist Church Cemetery. Sarah's pulse quickened. The initials CM matching what Catherine remembered from the locket. She searched for Charles Manning in the 1900 census. There he was, Charles Manning, age 23, occupation listed as farm laborer. And beside his name, wife, Mary Manning, age 20. Mary Manning. But also could be MC if she went by her maiden name initially. Sarah searched frantically for any other record of Mary Manning. Nothing in the 1900 census beyond that one entry. No death certificate in the years following. No marriage records to another man. No property deeds, no court documents, nothing. It was as if Mary Manning had existed just long enough to be recorded with her husband in the 1900 census and then vanished from history. Could the servant in the photograph be Mary Manning? A young widow, mourning her husband who died 6 months before the portrait was taken? But why would she be living with the Cartwrights? And why hide her identity? Sarah looked at the photograph again, seeing it with new eyes. If this was Mary Manning, widowed at 20 years old, wearing mourning gray, standing with a prominent family who refused to identify her by name, what was the connection? She needed more information about Charles Manning. Who was he? Where did he come from? And most importantly, what was his relationship to the Cartwright family? It was past midnight, but Sarah couldn't stop now. She was getting closer to the truth. She could feel it. The following morning, Sarah drove back to Henderson County, this time heading directly to the New Salem Baptist Church Cemetery. The original church had burned in 1943, and a new building stood on the site now, but the cemetery remained, its oldest stones dating back to the 1880s. The groundskeeper, a man in his 60s named Robert Hayes, was trimming hedges near the entrance when Sarah arrived. She explained that she was researching church history and looking for a specific grave from 1901. Charles Manning, Robert said, nodding. I know that one. It's in the old section, southeast corner. The stone's in pretty good shape, actually. Come on, I'll show you. They walked through the cemetery, passing generations of Henderson County families. The oldest section was shaded by massive oak trees, their roots pushing up some of the older stones at odd angles. Robert stopped at a simple marble headstone. Here it is. Sarah knelt beside the grave. The inscription was clear, Charles Andrew Manning. Born April 12, 1877. Died March 8, 1901. Beloved son and husband. Gone too soon. Beloved son Sarah murmure. Sinu. Robert, who had remained beside her, spoke quietly. My grandfather was groundskeeper here from the 1930s through the 70s. He used to tell me stories about the old families. I remember him mentioning the Mannings once. Said there was some kind of sad story there, but he never told me details. Is your grandfather still alive? No. Passed in 98. But he left journals. He was meticulous about everything related to this cemetery. Kept records of every burial, every stone repair, any family history he learned. I've got them all in my office. Sarah's heart leaped. Would it be possible for me to look at them? 30 minutes later, Sarah sat in the small groundskeeper's office beside the new church building, carefully turning pages of handwritten journals. Robert Hayes Sr. had beautiful, precise handwriting, and his notes were indeed meticulous. She found the entry for Charles Manning's grave. Beside the burial information, Robert Sr. had added a note. C. Manning grave maintained by Cartwright family through 1911. After Reverend Cartwright's death, maintenance ceased. Restored stone in 1936 at request of anonymous donor. The Cartwrights had maintained Charles Manning's grave. That confirmed a connection between the families. Sarah continued reading, and several pages later found another entry that made her catch her breath. While repairing the foundation of the Manning stone in May 1936, discovered a sealed box buried beside the grave. Contents, letters and a silver locket. Per church policy, items turned over to Reverend Matthews, who stated they were personal effects that should remain private. Box placed in church safe. Robert, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady, when the old church burned in 1943, what happened to the safe? They saved most of the important documents, Robert said. My grandfather helped carry things out. The church rebuilt in '44, and they transferred everything to the new building. Most of it's still in the church office, I believe. Sarah practically ran to the church office. The current pastor, Reverend Linda Morrison, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an immediately helpful demeanor. When Sarah explained what she was looking for, Reverend Morrison nodded thoughtfully. We do have a collection of historical items in our storage room. Some things from the original church that survived the fire. I've been meaning to organize them properly, but there's never enough time. You're welcome to look. The storage room was exactly what Sarah expected, boxes stacked on metal shelves, labeled with varying degrees of organization. She started with boxes marked pre-1950 and historical documents. It took 2 hours of careful searching, but finally, in a box labeled Personal Effects, 1936, Sarah found a small metal tin, badly rusted but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had long since deteriorated, was a bundle of letters and a silver locket. With trembling hands and Reverend Morrison as witness, Sarah opened the locket. Inside was a small photograph of a young couple. The man was lean and handsome, with kind eyes. The woman beside him was unmistakably the servant from the church portrait that on the inside cover of the locket, engraved in delicate script, CM and MC together always. Charles Manning and Mary, what had been her maiden name? Sarah carefully unfolded the first letter. It was dated February 1901, written in a feminine hand. My dearest Charles, I know you are worried about the future, but please trust that everything will be well. Your father may not approve now, but time will soften his heart. Our love is true, and that is what matters. Your mother sends her love, though she must be careful not to show it openly. Be strong, my darling. Soon we will be together always. All my love, Mary. Sarah's mind reeled. Charles's father. His mother who had to hide her affection. What family dynamics was she uncovering? She read through more letters, piecing together a story that became clearer and more heartbreaking with each page. Charles Manning wasn't just any farm laborer. He was Reverend Thomas Cartwright's illegitimate son. A letter from Charles to Mary, dated December 1900, spelled it out. Mary, my darling, I must tell you everything, though it pains me. My mother was very young when she worked for the Cartwright family, before the Reverend married Abigail. I am the result of that relationship. Abigail knows of my existence but has never acknowledged me publicly. My mother, who raised me in secret with financial support from the Cartwrights, made me promise never to reveal the truth. But I cannot marry you with lies between us. You deserve to know everything. Sarah sat back, the full picture finally coming into focus. Charles Manning was Thomas Cartwright's illegitimate son, conceived before Thomas married Abigail. The Cartwrights had supported him financially but kept the relationship secret to protect Thomas's reputation as a minister. Charles had married Mary. They lived quietly in the county, Charles working as a farm laborer despite being privately supported by his biological father. Then Charles died of pneumonia in March 1901, leaving his 20-year-old wife Mary alone, grieving and pregnant. The final letter, dated April 1901, was from Abigail Cartwright to Mary. Dear Mary, Thomas and I have discussed your situation at length. We feel a responsibility to you, both as Christians and as Charles's family, though we cannot acknowledge the connection publicly. I offer you a place in our household. You will be treated well and provided for, and when your child arrives, we will ensure both of you have what you need. However, I must insist on complete discretion. Our reputation and Thomas's position in the church depend upon maintaining the appearance that Charles was simply a farm laborer we assisted out of Christian charity. You will be known only as household help. Your true relationship to our family must remain unspoken. If you agree to these terms, please send word, and we will make arrangements. With sympathy for your loss, Abigail Cartwright. So that was it. Mary had accepted the Cartwrights' offer out of necessity. She became the unnamed servant, living with the family who were actually her in-laws, grieving her husband while carrying his child, unable to claim her true identity or her connection to the prominent family that housed her. But why include her in the church portrait at all? Sarah reread the letters and then understood. It was a compromise, a quiet acknowledgement. They couldn't name her publicly, couldn't acknowledge her relationship to Charles or, through him, to their family. But they could include her in the photograph, a silent witness to the family she belonged to but could never claim. Reverend Morrison, who had been reading over Sarah's shoulder, sat down heavily in a nearby chair. My goodness! That poor woman. I need to find out what happened to her, Sarah said. What happened to her child? They returned to the groundskeeper's journals, searching for any other mention of Mary Manning or the Cartwrights. Finally, in an entry from 1912, Robert Sr. had written, Reverend Cartwright buried today. Large funeral. Noted that Mrs. Abigail Cartwright was accompanied by a young woman and a child of about 10 years, both in mourning dress. Did not catch their names, but the woman stayed close to the family throughout the service. 10 years old in 1912 would mean the child was born in 1901 or 1902. Mary's child with Charles, Sarah returned to census records with new purpose. The 1910 census showed the Cartwright household, but again, no servant named Mary Manning. However, this time Sarah noticed something she'd missed before. Living next door to the Cartwrights was a small household consisting of Mary Collins, age 29, widow, and Catherine Collins, age 8. Mary Collins. Could Mary Manning have taken a different name to further protect the secret? Sarah searched for any record of a Mary Collins in Henderson County before 1910. Nothing. The name appeared to have been created just for that census. She searched forward in time. In the 1920 census, Mary Collins appeared again, still in Henderson County, still listed as a widow. Catherine Collins, now 18, was listed as a teacher at the local school that in the 1930 census. Mary Collins was 58 years old, still living in Henderson County. Catherine had married and was listed in a different household with her husband and 2 children. Mary Manning Collins lived until 1952, dying at age 71 in Henderson County. Her death certificate listed her place of birth as unknown and her parents as unknown. Even in death, her true identity remained partially hidden, but her daughter, Catherine, had lived a full life. Sarah traced Catherine's descendants forward. Catherine had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and multiple great-grandchildren. Many of them still lived in North Carolina. One of Catherine's great-granddaughters, Jennifer Matthews, lived in Asheville, less than 5 miles from Sarah's apartment. Sarah made the phone call, her hands shaking slightly. Hello. Is this Jennifer Matthews? Yes, who's calling? My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm a researcher, and I've discovered something about your family history that I think you'd want to know. Jennifer Matthews was a woman in her early 40s, an art teacher at an Asheville middle school. When she opened her door to Sarah 3 days later, her face showed both curiosity and uncertainty. I have to admit, Jennifer said, leading Sarah into a living room filled with plants and student artwork on the walls, your phone call was mysterious. What exactly have you found about my family? Sarah pulled out the file she'd carefully compiled. What do you know about your great-great-grandmother Catherine? Not much, Jennifer admitted. My grandmother mentioned her a few times. She said Catherine was a teacher, very proper, kept to herself mostly. She died when my grandmother was young, so there weren't many stories. Why? What about Catherine's mother? Jennifer shook her head. I don't know anything about her. I don't think my grandmother ever mentioned her at all. Sarah opened her file and removed the church portrait from 1901. She pointed to the young woman at the edge of the photograph. I believe this is your great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Manning. Over the next hour, Sarah told Jennifer everything she'd discovered. The illegitimate son of a prominent minister. The young widow, pregnant and alone. The arrangement that provided shelter but required silence. The hidden letters and the locket. The secret that shaped generations. Jennifer listened with tears streaming down her face. When Sarah finished, Jennifer was silent for a long moment. All my life, she finally said, I felt like there was something missing in our family story. My grandmother used to say that we came from nobody important, just poor mountain people trying to get by. But she'd say it with this odd tone, like she was sad about something she couldn't explain. Now I understand. Your family comes from the Cartwrights, Sarah said gently. Through Charles Manning and Mary, you're directly descended from one of Henderson County's most prominent families. But you're also descended from Mary, a woman who showed incredible strength. She lost her husband, accepted help that required her to hide her identity, raised her daughter despite everything, and lived a long life with quiet dignity. Jennifer wiped her eyes. Can I see the letters? Sarah had brought copies of everything, and Jennifer read through them slowly, touching the pages as if she could feel the connection to these people she'd never known. This locket, Jennifer said, looking at the photograph Sarah had taken of it. Do you know where it is now? It's still at the church, in their historical collection. But Jennifer, I think it belongs with you. They drove to the New Salem Baptist Church together. Reverend Morrison welcomed them warmly, and when Sarah explained Jennifer's connection to Mary Manning, the Reverend immediately agreed. This should be with family, Reverend Morrison said, carefully placing the locket in Jennifer's hand. It's been waiting a long time to come home. Jennifer opened the locket, studying the faces of Charles and Mary. They look so happy, she whispered. So young. They were, Sarah said. And even though their time together was short, they created something that lasted. Catherine became a teacher, breaking the cycle of poverty. She made sure her children got educations. Your grandmother became a nurse. Your mother was a social worker. You're a teacher. Mary's strength and determination echo through all of you. Over the following weeks, Sarah continued her research with Jennifer's help. They discovered more details about Mary's life after Charles's death. How she had lived in a small cottage on the Cartwright property, close enough to be part of the family but separate enough to maintain the fiction of being merely an employee. They found records showing that Abigail Cartwright had paid for Catherine's education, ensuring she could become a teacher. In Abigail's will from 1925, there was a bequest to Mary Collins and her daughter Catherine, in gratitude for years of faithful service, a phrase that now held deeper meaning. They discovered that Catherine had known the truth about her parentage. In a letter Catherine wrote to her own daughter in 1948, she explained, "My mother made me promise never to speak openly of our connection to the Cartwright family while Reverend Cartwright's legitimate children were alive. She wanted to protect them from scandal and me from any stigma. But I have always known who my father was, and I have always been proud of both my parents, even if the world didn't know their story." Sarah compiled everything into a comprehensive research paper and submitted it to the North Carolina Historical Review. The article, titled Hidden Heritage, Secret Families and Social Respectability in Early 20th Century Appalachia, was published 6 months later, but more important than the academic publication was what happened with the photograph. Jennifer contacted the Henderson County Historical Society and donated copies of all the letters and documents, along with the full story of Mary Manning. The Historical Society created a new exhibit about hidden families and secret identities in Appalachian history, and they updated the caption on the 1901 church portrait. Where it once read, "Household Servant, Name Unknown," it now said, "Mary Manning, 1881 to 1952, widow of Charles Manning and grandmother to the Matthews family line. A woman of strength who lived with quiet dignity despite circumstances that required her to hide her identity." A year after Sarah's initial discovery, the Historical Society hosted an event celebrating the completion of the exhibit. Jennifer attended with 15 members of her family, all descendants of Mary Manning and Charles Cartwright. They stood together in front of the photograph, finally able to claim their ancestor publicly. Catherine Cartwright Wilson attended the event as well, escorted by her son. She stood with Jennifer's family, acknowledging the connection that had been hidden for more than a century. "My great-grandfather made a mistake as a young man," Catherine said during the ceremony. "And then he and my great-grandmother made a choice that they thought was best for everyone, but it required a young woman to erase herself from history. I cannot change what they did, but I can acknowledge it now. Mary Manning was family. Her daughter Catherine was family. And all of you," she said, looking at Jennifer and her relatives, "are family." Sarah watched the ceremony with a sense of completion. The woman in the photograph finally had her name back. Her story was no longer lost to time. After the ceremony, Sarah found Jennifer standing alone in front of the photograph, studying Mary's face. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. Jennifer smiled through fresh tears. "I'm thinking that she's beautiful. And I'm thinking that I see her in my daughter's eyes, in my grandmother's determination, in my own stubbornness. She's been with us all along. We just didn't know her name." "You know it now," Sarah said. "And so does everyone else." Jennifer turned to Sarah. "Thank you for this. Thank you for caring enough about one unnamed woman in an old photograph to uncover the truth." "She deserved to be remembered," Sarah replied. "Everyone does." That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment and looked at the copy of the photograph that still occupied the center of her research table. Mary Manning's face gazed back at her, that direct, quiet, dignified expression that had first captured Sarah's attention more than a year ago. Sarah understood now what she'd seen in that gaze. It wasn't a plea to be remembered. It was confidence that someday, someone would care enough to uncover the truth. Mary had stood in that photograph knowing that even though her name would be erased, her image would remain. She had trusted that eventually, someone would ask the right questions. Sarah picked up her phone and called Margaret Walsh at the Historical Society. "Margaret, it's Sarah. I've been thinking about other photographs in the collection. How many other unnamed people are there in those old portraits?" "Oh, dozens," Margaret said. "Why do you ask?" "Because they all have stories," Sarah said. "And someone should tell them." 3 weeks later, Sarah launched a new research project, the Unnamed Project, dedicated to identifying and telling the stories of people who appeared in historical photographs without names or identities. She created a website where people could submit photographs, and she worked with historians, genealogists, and descendants to uncover the hidden stories behind anonymous faces. The project grew rapidly. Within 6 months, Sarah had a team of volunteer researchers across the country, all working to restore names and stories to people who had been erased from official records. They found domestic workers, immigrants who'd been deliberately excluded from family photographs, children born outside marriage, people whose identities were hidden to protect families from scandal or social stigma. Each story they uncovered was unique, but they all shared something in common. They were people who mattered, people whose lives had value and meaning, people who deserved to be remembered. Jennifer Matthews became one of the project's most dedicated volunteers, helping to research other hidden families in Appalachian history. She brought the locket to her classroom and used Mary's story to teach her middle school students about hidden histories and the importance of questioning official narratives. "What I want you to understand," she told her students, "is that history isn't just about the people whose names are in textbooks. It's also about the people whose names were deliberately left out. And when we find those people and tell their stories, we make history more complete and more truthful." On the anniversary of finding the photograph, Sarah returned to the Henderson County Cemetery with Jennifer and her family. They placed flowers on both Charles Manning's grave and on Mary's, which was in a different section of the cemetery under her adopted name of Mary Collins. "Should we try to get her headstone changed?" Jennifer asked. "To her real name?" Sarah considered it. "What do you think Mary would want?" Jennifer thought for a long moment, then shook her head. "I think she'd want both names remembered. Mary Manning was who she was born as, who she loved Charles as. But Mary Collins was who she became, who she raised Catherine as. Both names tell her story." They stood in silence for a moment, the October wind rustling through the oak trees, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and mountain air. "Do you think she knew?" Jennifer's daughter, a college student named Sarah, asked quietly. "Do you think she knew that someday we'd find out? That we'd know her name?" Sarah Bennett, the researcher who had started this entire journey, looked at the gravestones of Charles and Mary, separated in death as they were forced to be separated in life, but finally acknowledged and remembered together. "I think she hoped," Sarah said. "And hope is sometimes the strongest thing we have." As they walked back through the cemetery toward their cars, Sarah noticed something that made her stop. At the edge of the old section, partially hidden by overgrown grass, was a very old, weathered stone. The inscription was almost worn away, but she could just make out a name. Margaret Wallace, died 1895, age 19. Who's Margaret Wallace? Jennifer asked. Sarah pulled out her phone and took a photograph of the stone. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Because that was the thing about hidden histories. Once you started looking, you found them everywhere. Every unnamed face, every missing record, every deliberate omission was a story waiting to be discovered. And Sarah had learned that these stories mattered, not just to descendants but to everyone. They revealed truths about society, about power, about who gets remembered and who gets erased. Mary Manning's story had taught Sarah that even silence tells a story. Even absence leaves evidence. Even erasure creates a kind of record. If you know how to read it, as Sarah drove home that evening, she thought about all the other unnamed people waiting in old photographs, in forgotten records, in stories that had been deliberately hidden or accidentally lost. She thought about the researchers who would find them, the descendants who would finally learn where they came from, the truths that would emerge from shadows into light. Mary Manning was no longer the unnamed servant in the photograph. She was Mary Manning, beloved wife, devoted mother, woman of strength and dignity who survived loss and silence to create a legacy that stretched through 5 generations and counting. Her face in that 1901 photograph would always gaze directly at the camera, directly across time, directly at anyone who cared to look. And now, everyone who looked would know exactly who they were seeing. That, Sarah thought, was the most important thing. Not just that Mary's story had been discovered, but that it had been told, acknowledged, and honored. Her existence had been validated. Her life had been recognized as mattering. And somewhere, in whatever way the past speaks to the present, Sarah liked to imagine that Mary Manning knew. That after more than a century of forced silence and hidden identity, she finally had what every person deserves: a name, a story, and a place in history that no one could ever erase again. The unnamed servant had become Mary Manning. And Mary Manning would be remembered.